What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about Cha-ching! The Cold Commands by Richard K. Morgan. Now, obviously, I don't have a physical copy, and I had to read this thing off my phone, which is very irritating to me. It might have affected my experience a little bit, but still, let's be objective here, right? Anyway, for those that don't know, this is book number 2 in the Land Fit for Heroes trilogy. Now, if any of you have not read The Steel Remains yet, I just don't want you to worry too much about spoilers here in this review, because if you go back and watch my review for The Steel Remains, you'll see that it was kept somewhat vague for, good reason. I want to somewhat just kind of create a review for each book in the trilogy so people can review or, kind of see each one. They can take a look at the trilogy as a whole and decide if they want to dive in, because I do understand that these are books that are just not that easy to read. There is a lot of reward there for some, but I do think that maybe there are going to be a lot of people out there that want to know the whole scope, or at least get a better idea of the whole scope before jumping in. So all 3 of these reviews for this trilogy should be spoiler free from one another and of themselves, if that makes any sense. Let's get into it. So the Cold Commands will have us follow our 3 heroes that we found in the Steel Remains here into this tale. Now, just much like the Steel Remains, we will follow each one of our characters kind of in their own separate journey. Now, along the way, their paths will cross, and we will start to understand that their business together is far from over. We'll see Egar Dragonsbane as he's basically at a battle with civilization, because Egar is a very nomadic guy. He's one of those Magic warriors, you know what I mean? He's not used to city living. But now, after the events of the first book, he's living with Arketh here in the Empire. So we do get to see Egar basically become, go from brute to what he's supposed to be is a civilized member, of society here. But yeah, along the way, Egar starts to see stuff. He's just kind of finds it funny that he's starting to see other Magic warriors kind of being paid as guards here in the Empire. He just seems to find it interesting, and he does do a little investigation, and this really is what sends us down Egar's plotline. And then we have Arketh, and Arketh is definitely one of my favorite characters coming over from the last book. She is she's a Kirith half-breed, last of her kind, very capable, badass woman. But once again, we see that she's been reduced down to an advisor to the Emperor. We see this capable woman having to play the dumb games of powerful men. And when we start off with Arketh, the one thing I really like about this in the beginning is we're seeing that Arketh is she's basically withdrawing from the Crinzants. Remember in the last review, I mentioned that Arketh was an addict. And so when we start off here, we're actually watching Arketh try to kick her, her addiction. And this is cool because we actually get to see this play out a little bit. Now, Arketh gets a very, mysterious message from a very even more mysterious, cryptic helmsman. And this is really what sets Arketh on her path here in this story. She sets upon an expedition to basically go find out what's going on. The helmsman will send, gives her a clue. Now, Arketh has to go figure out what it is. And this mission will kind of flesh out a lot more of the oncoming threats, as well as just, the world building and lore here in this trilogy. Which brings me to Ringle of Eskith. Man, this guy. This was a lot of people, I feel had problems with Ringle, or at least he wasn't their favorite from the first one. He was definitely mine, though. I liked Ringle a lot. I enjoyed our cynical war hero from Gallows Gap. You know what I mean? He's a hero, but he's also he's not a good dude necessarily either. But as we've seen through The Steel Remains, Ringle has been marginalized his whole life. So his cynicism and a lot of his outlooks on life make a lot of sense. So if The Steel Remains, basically, Ringle's story was an investigation into the slave trade. So now here in the Cold Commands, Ringle's story is really the one of trying to abolish the slave trade. So when Ringle actually shows up in the story, it seems just a little fashionably late, and when he hits the pages, you're kind of like, yes! And it is a very kick-ass scene, right? This is Ringle whooping ass, dude, and it's action-packed and a lot of fun. But this also rolls into one of the darkest parts of this entire book. So this is a little spoilery, but I do believe like this is the stuff that people are going to want to know that have an interest in this series, because Richard K. Morgan just is not afraid to show you or remind you that his world, his fantasy world here, is brutal. And he will highlight it every chance he gets, and it will be graphic at times, and almost, too much for some. So this is one thing. It is a little spoilery, but at the same time, I think that people need to know this stuff before they invest their time in these books. So basically what happens is, when we see Ringle show up, yes, he kicks ass, and he basically saves these slaves, and he's like, basically infiltrates these slavers, and, he kind of wins the day, so to speak. But the thing is he takes one of the slavers, this female slaver, he basically hands her off to these soldiers and these people so she could be brutally gang raped. And she is. And you're just, like I said, it's one of those moments where you're like, Ringle hit the page and you're excited because he's kicking ass. You're like, yeah, Gil. And then this happens and you're like, what the fuck, Gil? Now, as brutal as all this may be, it is like really pushing this story in a it's really pushing the story forward, in a fast pace. It's really gripping, yes, gut-wrenching and brutal, but damn, it's like that was one thing I started to notice about the Cold Commands was it was it really got its footing and just took off much faster than its predecessor. Like this thing was like going somewhere quick. Now from here, I will say that Ringle gets caught up in those gray places, and his journey is just not so much a straightforward one, and it can be very disorientating and just, confusing at times. But all in all, it's still very much a cynical Ringle show. So the first thing I really want to dive into is just kind of like the story's structure, because it's kind of a familiar one from the first one. Like I said, we're following 3 different perspectives. They're both like running separate different kind of stories, and then they meet up, right? So for one, I think that kind of grated on me just a little bit. I was kind of hoping that we were going to get like a different kind of structure maybe, but all in all, that's not a huge gripe. It's just, it seemed a little repetitive almost just in the structure of the story. Now, here's another thing though. As well as it felt a little bit repetitive, here's another thing, like we start off really nice and fast, and like I said, it seems like we've just gripped the ground and we're pushing forward. But after that, we just seem to kind of work our way into this, where we're just kind of going in a circle. And in this circle, it's not saying nothing happens. There's still stuff going down, but the majority of what's going on in the story is not really like pushing the plot or working towards a plot. Story's not being pushed forward. We're just really fleshing out the world, the lore, the characters, the oncoming threat. So all this stuff really gets explored throughout these journeys. My issue is I feel like I just kind of thought that we had almost done that in book 1, and I feel like we're just kind of doing it again here in book 2. Granted, we're doing it on a very much like grander scale. We're opening we're opening all the nooks and crannies a little further and getting a bigger, piece of this picture. One of the things I absolutely love about the book is the action, and if any of you guys caught my discussion about Abercrombie, where I mentioned it's just like Richard K. Morgan and Joe Abercrombie probably write some of the best action I've ever read in fantasy for sure. It's just a fact. And Richard K. Morgan's brutal, beautiful action is in here as well. I do feel like it seemed like it was just kind of tamed a little bit, not on a grand scale, just barely noticeable, but I did feel like that some of it, like I said, this seemed to be like we were digging into lore, world building, like the ethics and just politics of this world way more than we were like out there chopping people up kind of thing. But like I said, anytime I think I read a Richard K. Morgan book, I'm probably going to talk a little bit about this action because it is just beautiful and it's visceral and it's graphic. I think that's the one thing that Richard K. Morgan, with not just his action, with pretty much all the elements that he puts in his books, he just makes sure they're graphic and they're in your face, and his action is really no different. Though I got to admit, you can get kind of like caught up in the poeticness of it. You know what I mean? Because like I said, it's just brutal yet beautiful. I also want to take just a quick second and talk about the magic in the book because it's something that's not going to be extremely explained. It was very mysterious. Any bits of magic we got in the first book, it's going to be it just kind of is confusing here in the second book. But I will say that there's definitely more hints of magic, and as the story progresses, we get to see, I guess, as the story progresses, so do the displays of magic, for sure. And they can be very destructive and lots of fun to read. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Richard K. Morgan has a flair for the graphic. All things graphic, I think. But this story, just like book one, this contains a lot of stuff that is probably going to be a little too heavy hitting for some. Just like in the first book, we have things like the slave trade in here. This book is going to touch a lot on stuff. It's going to put that religious fanaticism in your face. It's going to touch on the dark parts of imperialism, and obviously, this is something that he's going to hit you with in both, the sex in the book, man. It's going to be both consensual and not. That's basically like an ongoing thing in Richard K. Morgan books from what I'm seeing. So that's another thing you might want to kind of keep in mind. If you're somebody that doesn't really like to read erotic scenes, there are going to be plenty in his books, as well as just as I mentioned earlier, there will also be, there's going to be rape in his world. He does not shy away from, showing you how brutal it can be here. Now, as far as my 2 cents for the slow and the struggling, it's going to be pretty similar to as from book one. I would say pump your brakes, man. This is the thing, and the more I read of Morgan, I think I'm becoming able to kind of pinpoint and express these issues, these problems that his writing and his books contain. It's not just, tough at times to read because of the brutality. Richard K. Morgan has a very heavy prose, and it's also very intelligent. And it can leave you feeling like a dummy at times. It can leave you having to reread chapters, pages, you know what I mean, to fully grasp what he's throwing in your face. When you finally get it, and it is impressive, but it's also not going to be for everybody. It's definitely an acquired taste, and it's a big hurdle for a struggling reader. This is, probably almost as advanced of, writing as I've digested. And I definitely just would say pump the brakes. But if you're one of those cats like me that's just rebellious in spirit and won't listen to me at all, I would suggest buddy read it. Buddy read it with as many people as you can, because that way you can at least bounce all this crazy shit off of one another and hopefully come up with, an actual understanding of the story by the end of it. Now, for slow readers, I just think, if prose and all these things are just, you don't have struggles, you're just a slow reader, I do think that the Land Fit for Heroes trilogy so far is shaping up to something that is worth it, but I do feel it's a bit niche. So, we'll find out a lot how it all goes in the next book. But so far, I would definitely recommend this trilogy to people, but it's not going to be for everybody. Now, as always, thanks for spending some time down here at the channel. And to Richard K. Morgan, you are an intelligent madman that is brutal, and I can get behind that, and I'm going to continue to follow you, sir. I certainly hope all this setup certainly pays off in the next book, but we'll see. Either way, Alright, guys, I gotta go. If you're new, please like and subscribe. It really helps me grow this channel, guys. Alright, as always, peace.